remembered we talked about me reading you Shir HaShirim. Sorry, I wasn't here to do it. I owe you chapter 1 of Shir HaShirim the next time we see each other, okay? So this week's Torah portion, pretty demanding. We'll get to that in a minute. When I do my Passover cleaning, I get a little overwhelmed when I look at the whole picture. Does that happen to anyone else? No? like you're a week away from the Seder, and you start maybe making a list, and then the list just gets longer and longer. You're like, well, if I'm going to vacuum the crumbs out of that cupboard, maybe I should also do this cupboard. And it just grows and grows to the point where I think, I just don't want to do anything, right? Like, it's too hard. It would help if someone would give me a minimum or a maximum. That would help too, right? How far is too far? How little is too little? And in this week's Torah portion, we read about the most admirable economic justice. Really, it's incredible to give tithes of 10% on top of other tithes, to be willing to allow your indentured servants to go on the 7th year, not when they've been your indentured servant for 7 years, but on the Shemitah cycle. So maybe you made the indentured servitude 2 years ago, you got 2 years of labor from them, and then to let them go. To talk about remitting debts in the Shemitah cycle too. Again, not in your 7th year of the loan being paid back, but in the 7-year cycle of Shemitah. And then to be told that you should travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year and bring gifts to God. I mean, if you've traveled, you know it gets expensive. These are huge economic demands to make on people. In fact, scholars are uncertain as to whether society, Israelite society, ever kept all of these demands. It is an aspirational economy. It's a beautiful way to think about nothing actually belonging to us, so it's okay when we have to give up our servants and our debts and make these journeys to Jerusalem. The economic loss is okay in the biblical context because it wasn't ours to begin with. What a beautiful vision, but it's like me standing in front of my kitchen on Passover thinking, how am I going to actually accomplish all of that economic justice? So let's take one example from the long list of things that we were given in Re'eh about a just economy. In chapter 16, verse 16, it says, 3 times a year, on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, on the Feast of Weeks, and on the Feast of Booths, all your males shall appear before your God in the place that God will choose. Okay, that seems to give a minimum or a maximum 3 times a year. But then it says, they shall not appear before God empty-handed. Okay, we've all been guests. We know when we're going to God's house, we should bring a gift. Are we talking a handful of flour or an ox, right? Because those are 2 very different things economically. It doesn't say. You know where this piece of text gets picked up? You can find it in our morning liturgy. If you'd like to look at it yourself, it's on page 107 in this red Siddur. It's a piece of Mishnah, and why it appears in our morning liturgy is, okay, here's a sidebar. One of the first things we say, we don't in our congregation, but many congregations, is a blessing for the Torah and the ability to study Torah verses. Now, the reason we do that is pretty much the rest of this book is made out of verses from the Torah. So you want to say the blessing for Torah before you start praying. Okay. Now, not only do we consider the Torah, but the Mishnah and the Talmud, the rabbinic interpretations and elucidations on the Torah are also considered sacred texts. So if you look at 107, you say the blessing for Torah, you immediately say a verse of Torah, and then it's followed up with the Mishnah and the Talmud, and here is the reference to Deuteronomy 16:16. It comes from Mishnah Peah, the very first Mishnah in Masechet Peah. These are the deeds for which there is no prescribed measure. Ugh, that's exactly my problem. There's no minimum, no maximum. Leaving the produce at the corner of the field for the poor, offering the gift of first fruits to the temple, and pilgrimage offerings on the 3 festivals. Aha, That's ours, right? That's from 1616. You bring a gift to the pilgrimage festival. Deeds of kindness and love and the study of Torah. None of those things, when you start out in the Mishnah, have a minimum or maximum. But the rabbis in the Talmud were wise, and the very next thing that happens when you start reading the text in the Talmud is they say, you know, there's always an overachiever, and there's always an underperformer. If this is a group project, right, there's always the person that does the work for everyone else, or depending on your point of view, the person who makes everyone else look bad. So if this just economy were a group project, we'd have overachievers and underperformers like everywhere else. And the rabbis in the Talmud come along right after this Mishnah and say, no. These things are not beyond measure. And they actually start spelling out how much do you have to give at a minimum, and is there a maximum? Because they know when the rules in Re'eh are set out for us to appear 3 times a year and bring a gift and give up our slaves, and sure, I don't need to collect on that debt, they know that that's as overwhelming as standing before your cupboards on the week before Passover, figuring out where to start your cleaning. So the Torah is all about what could be, what might be. And the Talmud comes along to make it what can be, to help us get a grasp on how to live towards a time when perhaps that kind of economic generosity and equality will be possible. So my blessing for us is that we find time to contemplate what our minimums and maximums are. Perhaps we do that in one of the rabbi's classes or one of Barry's classes where we learn more about what the Mishnah and Talmud have to say about minimums and maximums. Or perhaps it's something we consider for ourselves. In creating a more just and compassionate world, do I have a minimum or maximum that I can set for myself so I don't get overwhelmed and I do engage in making the world a better place?